The Epic versus Apple battle has taken a turn I never would have guessed. Yesterday, I published a video about how Microsoft and Meta were backing Epic in their lawsuit against Apple. Despite loving Apple, I don't love monopolies, and it's been really frustrating seeing them take advantage of their position as the best mobile platform and using that to prevent whole new industry categories from existing. I have a bunch of videos where I complain about this, so maybe check those out if you want to hear more, because today we're not focused on the history of this whole case, we're focused on the most recent ally joining the side of Epic. And it's not a small ally, it's a big ally, possibly the biggest ally you could have in an antitrust hearing. The Department of Justice is now joining Epic, not directly, but they're targeting Apple themselves in a new lawsuit going after Apple for antitrust violations. I never thought we would see the day, but the day is here, and now the US is suing Apple for a legal monopoly over smartphones. From the bit I've learned thus far, I don't agree with everything that the US has cited in this case. And again, people aren't going to love my takes on this overall. Just know I 100% agree that Apple has a monopoly, especially over the App Store. It is Apple's control over other industry categories that I'm most frustrated with. Apple has a portion of the smartphone market. Somehow this has given them permission to control what types of games those users are allowed to play, what types of software they're allowed to install, what types of payment processors they're allowed to use. My issue isn't that Apple has a monopoly over smartphones. They have a monopoly over which software our smartphones can use, which is in many ways way worse. So what's this lawsuit about? Let's take a look. The Department of Justice claims Apple has maintained an illegal monopoly over the smartphone market by locking in customers and making experiences worse for rival products. This is the part I think is kind of bullshit, and we'll get there in a bit. The US DOJ has accused Apple of operating an illegal monopoly in the smartphone market in an expansive new antitrust lawsuit that seeks to upend many of the ways Apple locks down iPhones. The DOJ, along with 16 state and district attorney generals, accuses Apple of driving up prices for consumers and developers at the expense of making users more reliant on its phones. This is where I start to disagree. If Apple was the only company driving prices of these things up, maybe, but of the most expensive phones you can buy right now, literally 0 of them are by Apple. All of the most expensive phones right now are by other companies. Samsung has taken advantage of the folding phone thing and used that to drive all their prices up across all of their lines. You used to be able to get a Galaxy phone from Samsung for like $300. Now you can't get any decent Samsung phone for under $8. That's insane. And they got away with that because Apple did it first, but they then took what Apple did with increasing the price like $100 to $200 and used it to justify a 2 to 5x increase. Actual insanity. Ugh. The parties allege that Apple selectively imposes contractual restrictions on developers and withholds critical ways of accessing the phone as a way to prevent competition from arising, according to the release. I will absolutely agree with this part. They selectively impose weird restrictions on developers. I've been complaining about this forever. It's very clear and obvious if you look into any of the cases that I've cited in the past. Apple exercises its monopoly power to extract more money from customers, developers, content creators, artists, publishers, small businesses, and merchants, among others. I like the content creators and small publishers call out here specifically, because something people don't appreciate is that Apple's strict 30% cut makes things really hard for other platforms to justify paying creators. I'm streaming this live on Twitch right now. Twitch takes a 30 to 50% cut depending on how well I'm doing and if I'm in their fancy Partner Plus program or not. So if you pay me $5, which is all it costs to subscribe, by the way, $5 a month, consider it, that $5 a month becomes $2.50 that I get, and then $2.50 goes to Twitch. Now it's closer to like $3 to me, $2 to Twitch, but you get the idea. What happens when Apple takes 30% on top? Now, if we're still charging that same $5, we're down to $3 that are being split between Twitch and me. It ends up cutting my cut in like half because now Twitch has to compete with Apple to get the cut that they're trying to get. And the only solution here is to increase the price by 30% to account for the fact that Apple's taking a fee on top. So now, when you try to support me using your iPhone, Apple takes a cut for being the phone that you did it on. Twitch takes a cut for providing the platform that I did it on, which is a much more reasonable cut to take. And then and only then I get what's left. That sucks. That genuinely really sucks. And it's honestly affected a lot of platforms that want to do more creator monetization. I should be monetized on Twitter right now, and I'm not because Twitter's attempts to add more monetization features have gotten them kind of locked out by Apple, and they're unable to add subscriptions to my account because of how the processing for new subscription accounts goes through Apple. Because Apple has to approve every single creator that is doing subscriptions on Twitter due to the way that their subscriptions platform works, which you are forced to use when you use an iPhone. They can't make their own subscription platform. That's the whole problem here. If I have a credit card on my Twitch account and I'm using the Twitch phone app, I'm literally not allowed to use the credit card on my account. I have to use Apple Pay. That should be illegal. I will go straight up and say that. It is absolute bullshit and has caused whole industry categories to not be able to go further. Think about how much more interesting platforms like Twitch and Twitter would be if you didn't have to pay Apple 30% every time you support a creator. It would entirely change how a lot of these platforms work. And because Apple wants their cut, whole industry categories don't get to exist. Absurdity. The government points to several different ways that Apple has allegedly illegally maintained its monopoly. Here's where I'm going to start disagreeing a bit. They're disrupting super apps that encompass many different programs that could degrade the iOS stickiness by making it easier for iPhone users to switch to competing devices. If you're not familiar with a super app, in other regions, it's somewhat common for apps like WeChat to be the app that you do everything in. WeChat has everything from shopping to banks to crypto exchanges to obviously chatting with your friends to QR code scanners to a fancy camera experience, all sorts of stuff, because WeChat is the app you use in China. It just is. They won that. And it's one app that has everything. My counter argument here is that those super apps are way more monopolistic in nature than anything Apple did. So I don't love the idea of the government jumping in to destroy one monopoly to enable a different one. On top of that, I don't have any examples of Apple doing this. Have they ever banned an app for adding too much functionality? Because I've never seen that before. This is another case of the thing I saw with the EU a bit that really frustrated me, which is that these governments suing Apple aren't suing them based on specific harms they're seeing apply to individuals. They're suing them based on a perceived vibe. What I would like to see with all of these legislations, all of these changes, all of these lawsuits, is enabling for individuals who are harmed by Apple to have what they need to sue Apple. I, as a creator, ideally, would have the right laws I need to go after Apple for taking the cut that they take, because that's bullshit and monopolistic. But I should be able to, as an individual, sue Apple for doing that. This shouldn't be the government suing Apple for a vibe. It should be the government adding new laws that enable me to sue Apple for being bullshit. And you do that by forming these things around individual, specific, pointed, nameable harms, which I'm not seeing here. This is one that is much more so the case, and I've complained about this quite a bit. The blocking cloud streaming apps for things like video games that would lower the need for more expensive hardware. I don't love the more expensive hardware bit. It's more that this is a whole category that isn't allowed to exist because Apple didn't like it. Microsoft wanted to make Xbox game streaming a thing where you could stream Xbox games on your phone from the cloud. Apple wouldn't let them because, according to Apple, even though you can stream movies and music and audiobooks and TV shows and all these other things, streaming games is a fundamentally different thing, according to them, because games are interactive. And once it's interactive, it's software. And once you're providing software in an app, you're now making an alternative app store, and they'll ban you for that. Absurd that just by having a controller attached, Netflix is no longer allowed on the App Store because that's how they want to do it. According to Apple's terms and their public statements, they would be okay with Xbox game streaming to be enabled on the App Store if every game was an individual purchase that people made through the App Store that was also reviewable by Apple themselves. Absurd. They're supposedly walking this back, but they haven't really done it, so we'll see where that goes. Suppressing the quality of messages between iPhone and competing platforms like Android. Nope, fuck you. This one's nonsense. This point in particular makes me skeptical of the entire fucking suit because it is such nonsense. I can message an Android phone however the hell I want. I go to the App Store, I install a messaging app, and then I do whatever I want to with it. If this is about SMS, cool. SMS has sucked and always sucked. The fact that they supported that is a nicety. Apple doesn't have to support these standards, especially when RCS is a shit standard that is only encrypted if you use Google's proprietary encryption technology. The reason Google pushed RCS so hard is so they could force every single carrier to pay them fees to use their encryption service for RCS. Apple refused to do that because they're not going to implement some non-standard bullshit. And since Apple won't just implement Google's bullshit, they actually proposed an encryption standard for RCS that is open for everyone to use. And it's going to be really funny when they get that merged in, they implement it, they put it on their phones, and then Google says they won't support it because it's not the encryption that they charge for. And you know the Android fanboys are going to support Google in that scenario because that's what they fucking do. So yeah, this is bullshit. The iMessage thing is stupid. Possibly the most I've ever worked on a video in my life. I can say that confidently. The most I've ever worked on a video in my life was my unnecessarily detailed history of iMessage on Android. This video took me so goddamn long to research, write, film, edit, and publish. It was one of my worst performing videos ever. So I implore you, before you leave a stupid comment about Android and RCS, please watch this video and leave the comment over there because this is not the place for it. Anyways, next point. Limiting the functionality of third-party smartwatches with its iPhones and making it harder for Apple Watch users to switch from the iPhone due to compatibility issues. I'm mad they included this for a bunch of subtle, stupid reasons. The main one is that the guy who's the dumbest about this stuff, the CEO of Beeper, also happened to make the Pebble smartwatches, which gets cited in this document, which he is now using as justification for he was right the whole time. No, it's stupid, absurd. Yeah. I don't like this point that much at all, because if Apple sells, let's say, like, where's the line here? This is a really hard line for me to draw. If I have a case for my iPhone, which in this case I don't, because my case is the Apple Care Plus program, but when I do put a case on my phone, it's often a case I bought from Apple at the Apple Store. Does Apple need to make sure that their smartphone cases work with phones that aren't iPhones? No. Where's the line here? How do we define what only should work on an iPhone that Apple sells and what shouldn't work on an iPhone that Apple sells? Personally, I am totally okay with the idea that Apple can make really good experiences for devices that work only with their stuff. And it's not like they're actually doing that either. AirPods are the best way to listen to music on an Android phone still, which is hilarious to me. I know a lot of people, even in chat right now, that are Android users using AirPod Pros, because the AirPods are a great device that are still using Bluetooth standards. At any point, Apple could have moved off Bluetooth. In fact, probably would have benefited them to do it, but they didn't do that because they chose to focus on the standard. Apple's actually been really good about standards, especially lately. They've been pushing standards forward incredibly far, more than I ever would have expected. And to all the chatter saying whatever fucking Sony headphone that has blown out bass is better than Apple, get your ears checked. Blocking third-party developers from creating competing digital wallets with tap-to-pay functionality for the iPhone. This is a little too specific for my taste, but it is also a fair point to make too, in that there's a lot of specific features that your iPhone has and hardware that it includes that others aren't able to access, which is annoying. One example here that's affected me is that my building uses an NFC-based key system for getting into my apartment. That system works using Apple Wallet, theoretically at least, but they weren't allowed to implement it. So even though I could theoretically put a card for my apartment as a key inside of my Apple Wallet, up until recently, they just straight up didn't let that happen. They allowed for car keys, but not other types of keys, because they just didn't want to. As a result, I have to use an app to open my door instead. The app uses the NFC on my door to bump and connect via Bluetooth, and then uses the Bluetooth connection to authenticate me, which is fucking hilarious because the hardware in my phone to do this right is there, and my old Android phone I dicked around with does it just fine, but Apple chose to restrict the hardware that they put in the phone that is following open standards. And that's where I personally draw the line is, on one hand, Apple pushes these standards forward and makes them way better, but on the other hand, they don't always give us access to the things that are standard that they're implementing and putting in their stuff in the first place. This is where my frustration is. For years, Apple responded to competitive threats by imposing a series of whack-a-mole contractual rules and restrictions that have allowed Apple to extract higher prices from consumers, impose higher fees on developers and creators, and to throttle competitive alternatives from rival technologies, is the statement from the DOJ Antitrust Division's chief, Jonathan Cantor, in the statement. The enforcers are asking the court to stop Apple from using its control of app distribution to undermine cross-platform technologies such as super apps and cloud streaming apps, prevent it from using private APIs to undermine cross-platform technologies like messaging, smartwatches, and digital watches, and to keep it from using the terms and conditions on its contracts with developers, accessory makers, consumers, or others to obtain, maintain, extend, or entrench a monopoly. There's little bits in here I agree and disagree with. I could break it down word by word, like messaging isn't something that's under a private API. You can install any messaging app you want. The only thing that's locked down is the ability to send SMSs using the SIM card through the carrier, and theoretically any carrier can implement their alternatives there. I know T-Mobile, for example, has been doing this type of stuff forever. So that's not restricted, just wrong. Smartwatches, I could see this one a bit more in this context, specifically the ability to connect another brand smartwatch to your phone. There's a lot of things the Apple Watch can get from your phone, just data-wise, notification-wise, etc., that other watches don't have access to because those are proprietary APIs. That I can see the argument for. This is actually the argument that won the Department of Justice versus Microsoft case back in the day. It wasn't that Microsoft was evil and adding Internet Explorer in by default, which is what everyone seemed to think it was. The actual thing Microsoft lost that case on was the fact that they'd implemented things in the operating system of Windows that allowed for Internet Explorer to do cool, fancy, faster things that other browsers were not allowed access to. That is why they lost. There were APIs in the operating system that theoretically anyone could use that Microsoft only allowed Internet Explorer to use. Those types of things are a little more fair. At a press conference on Thursday announcing the lawsuit, Department of Justice Deputy Attorney General Lisa Monaco said that Apple has maintained a chokehold on competition and smothered an entire industry through its shift from revolutionizing the smartphone makers to stalling in advancement. Cantor added that Apple was a significant beneficiary of the Department of Justice suit against Microsoft over 20 years ago, and the case aims to protect competition and innovation for the next generation of technology. Fair. Good old Merrick Garland. The resource imbalance the government's up against facing a company worth trillions of dollars. That's really a fair point. I don't think this is going to get enough attention in other things. Apple's the second most valuable company in the world. That's hard to sue. That's scary. And even the government doesn't necessarily have the positioning to do that easily. Although, on the other hand, they're the only ones that have it. So, yeah. When you have an institution with a lot of resources that, in our view, is harming the American economy and the American people, it's important for us to allocate our resources to protect the American people. And that is certainly the case where individual Americans have no ability to protect themselves. I actually really like this statement. The one thing I would again push is that it'd be nice for them to use these resources to defend individuals who are harmed by these things rather than going after Apple themselves. To be fair, the optics of the US versus Apple help a lot because it validates the case people have. I know for a long time when it was just Epic versus Apple, people were like, what's this random gaming company? Oh, is it just Fortnite being greedy? God, I've seen some really stupid takes about Fortnite and Epic and their 12% cut recently. We might get to that in a bit. I want to focus on this part because, again, the value of the DOJ going after them isn't even that they might win, it's that it validates going after Apple in the first place. Apple's already made a statement. Fun. Was this today? Let's just dig right into their statement. Apple's response to the DOJ iPhone antitrust lawsuit. At Apple, we innovate every day to make technology people love, designing products that work seamlessly together, protect people's privacy and security, and create a magical experience for our users. This lawsuit threatens who we are and the principles that set Apple products apart in fiercely competitive markets. If successful, it would hinder our ability to create the kind of technology people expect from Apple, where hardware, software, and services intersect. It would also set a dangerous precedent, empowering governments to take a heavy hand in designing people's technology. We believe this lawsuit is wrong on the facts and the law, and we will vigorously defend against it. That's one of the least awful statements I've seen from Apple recently. I don't love it, but it's not the worst thing they've said. Specifically, the point about this hindering them compared to competition, like this can only go one of two ways. One way it goes is that Apple's not allowed to do these things anymore. Competition is, and the competition now is a competitive advantage. Like if Apple has to allow for all watches to have the same functionality on the iPhone that the Apple Watch has, now they don't just have to make something work on the watch. They have to make it work for all watches, which if anyone here has built a service that was usable for anyone rather than just from your website, it's way harder to make things generic. Making a device that cuts apples really well is much easier than making a device that cuts everything really well. And that's not an easy balance to strike. If Apple is forced to find that balance in everything they build and other companies aren't, that sucks because now they're forced in a behind position because they happen to get too big. On the other side of this, if they enforce this for everyone, the cost of building something in the first place that's useful goes up so much. Because if I just make a watch for my random indie smartphone, that's going to be much harder to do if I also have to make it an open standard every step along the way. So this does, without question, harm innovation, which again brings me back to my previous point. Really nice that this legislation was focused less on these perceived harms and more on the actual companies that were being harmed. It would be way easier for me to back Microsoft suing Apple because they banned them from doing a specific industry category on their platform. It's comically easy for me to back Epic versus Apple because Epic's been actively harmed by Apple's decision-making, and they have proof of that in spades, as I've covered many a time. The Department of Justice going after them is a lot harder to justify here, and that's a theme throughout this. It's also an interesting point that there just haven't been many DOJ cases like this since the Microsoft case all the way back in 2001. There was like that one case against Google, but not too much else since then, which is nice to see that we're actually seeing real things happen. Again, don't love the case itself thus far, but there's points to make. The fact that like Spotify wasn't referenced when they've been absolutely fucked, and they've been going after Apple for a while because Spotify has to pay these giant fees. So they try to get you to subscribe on their website, but then Apple doesn't let you tell the user on your app, hey, by the way, you have to go to the website to subscribe. So you end up with an app you can't do anything with. These things just build up and suck. And I would absolutely say this is monopoly power. Congress of House Subcommittee carried out a few years ago, 2020 report by a panel found that Apple held monopoly power in the market for app distribution on iOS. Yep. This is the core point. There's obviously a monopoly that Apple has on the App Store and software distribution on iOS. The rest of it is a little more questionable. This is what I would love to see. Laws that make it easier for companies to demonstrate the harm that's been caused and say, hey, Apple broke this law and hurt me in this way. I want to sue them for it. That's when you start to see real change. And if this isn't that, this is instead weird new legislation that doesn't immediately enable those things, that gets a little messier. The $2 billion fee, this is more what I'm talking about because it's a complaint from Spotify. Spotify had demonstrated harm. They went to the EU committee, and the EU Commission found that Apple indeed was breaking this law, hurting Spotify, and they got fined a shitload of money for it, which is absolutely the case. Apple keenly understands that while a community of developers and accessory makers is indispensable to the success of the iPhone, they also pose an existential threat to its extraordinary profits by empowering consumers to think different and choose perfectly functional, less expensive alternative smartphones. Nope, this is just stupid. Apple's smartphone business model at its core is one that invites as many participants, including iPhone users and third-party devs, to join in its platform as possible while using contractual terms to force these participants to pay substantial fees. Yep, this I totally agree with. At the same time, Apple restricts its platform participants' ability to negotiate or compete down its fees through alternative app stores, in-app payment processors, and more. A++. If this was the core of this suit, I would be 1000% on board. In order to protect the model, Apple reduces competition in the markets for performance smartphones and smartphones generally. It does this by delaying, degrading, or outright blocking technologies that would increase the competition in the smartphone market by decreasing barriers to switching to another smartphone, amongst other things. These suppressed technologies would provide a high-quality user experience on any smartphone, which would, in turn, require smartphones to compete on their merits. Show me. The only thing people have here is iMessage, and it's so stupid because literally every other market in the world just uses WhatsApp. The fact that Americans are too lazy to install a different app isn't something the government should come in and force new rules around. That's a marketing problem, not a legal problem. This is a really good point here too, specifically about the arbitrarily and selectively enforced restrictions where they just let some companies ignore them. Like Amazon, for example, is part of some special program where Amazon Prime and Prime Video can use your credit card on your Amazon account because they're a partner, some crazy weird new video platform partner thing with Apple that allows them to do that. That's only a thing because Apple was scared of Amazon going apeshit if they didn't do it. They didn't do the same thing for Spotify, so Spotify went after them and they lost $2 billion as a result. This, I agree, the selective enforcement in particular, absolute bullshit. The complaint highlights 5 examples, and this was the super apps thing, which I thought was stupid, the cloud streaming, which I totally agreed with, messaging, which is somehow even dumber, smartwatches, which I was iffy about at first. Specifically, the Apple Watch shouldn't have to use other things, but other watches should have the same access the Apple Watch does, some amount. And the digital wallets thing is subtle, but I largely agree, specifically the NFC side of it, where I have an NFC reader and writer on my phone that's functionality is limited by the operating system. It is frustrating to not see the App Store called out here, though. That's the big thing I think is missed, where like payment processors are not a thing that have competition. I can install a different messaging app on my phone. I can install a different camera app on my phone. I can install a different wallet app on my phone. I cannot install a different app if it has its own payment processing in it, unless it's selling physical goods or services or Apple likes you too much. There's a whole type of thing, which is alternative payment processors that Apple has chosen they will not allow. That is the line I draw. This is one of the funniest points from here. Thank you, Chance Miller, for pointing it out. The DOJ cited the fact that one of the obstacles moving from iPhone to Android is that they have to relearn how to operate their smartphones using a new interface, seemingly implying that Apple would have to make their interfaces more like Android in order to comply with these antitrust legislations. That is fucking hilarious. In my opinion, this shows very strongly how much this lawsuit overreaches. The fact that Apple's UI being better than Android's UI is being thrown in here terrifies me. Absolutely terrifies me. This is the slippery slope. I'm no longer doing the slippery slope thing where I think this could go too far. This is it going too far in front of our fucking faces. And this is, again, not justifying what Apple's doing. There's so much shit that Apple is doing wrong that is super monopolistic and antitrust and bad and harmful to developers and free markets. Their UI being good is not one of those goddamn things. Somebody else wrote a quick article on their thoughts on the Department of Justice versus Apple case. Thank you, Spyglass, for this. Really excited to have someone else backing me up so it's not just me yelling at my camera in a room. With the very large caveats that I'm not a lawyer, let alone an antitrust lawyer, and that I haven't yet fully read all 88 pages of the DOJ case against Apple, and I do mean yet, as it's actually sort of interesting, if humorous read so far. Here are a few initial quick takes on this. First, I have to imagine Apple's case is going to be pretty strong here. If nothing else, their market position simply doesn't scream monopoly, let alone illegal monopoly on the surface. According to recent estimates, the iPhone has something between 50 to 60% of the market share in the US. This isn't Windows with 90% market share. And yes, there's obviously more to it than just market share, but the fundamental aspect is going to linger over the entire case. You can disagree with the current laws and definitions, like the profit share bullshit, but it's hard to see a world in which the smartphone market isn't competitive from a pure market share perspective. This is a very good point. The traditional antitrust argument of they own the whole marketplace, they need to be broken up, does not apply here at all. It was really funny, actually, when the beeper guy was trying to cite the AT&T case as an example of how Apple is super monopolistic. It was funny for a bunch of reasons. For me, the biggest one was that you couldn't install a different carrier on your phone when you were using AT&T, but I can absolutely install a different messaging app on my phone when I'm using an iPhone. It's just silly. really dumb argument that makes no sense whatsoever. The part here that I do think is important that isn't touched on enough is that there's a big distinction with Windows, where despite having 90% plus market share, they let you install whatever software you want. I know that because I have a lot of programs on my Windows computer right now that Microsoft certainly does not want on it. And that is not just fine, but great and fully legal. Android, for the most part, also allows this, where you can install custom apps without going through the App Store. This is where Apple's kind of bullshitting, where they have 50 to 60% of the market, but this market share does not allow you to install different software on it. My argument would be that Apple and companies like John Deere are equally fucked up in this scenario, not because of the percentage of the market they own, but because I purchased the device and I can't choose what software it runs. That sucks. Blah. That's the issue I have there. But I fully agree with this point that the size of the market share is not the relevant piece. And trust me, I have the right to cite the John Deere stuff. I come from a farm town. I've been affected. I have family members that were really good at fixing tractors that now had to learn how a Raspberry Pi and Linux works in order to fix their tractors illegally. Absurd. Point 2. Even just on a quick scan, there are some comically bad misunderstandings both of how technology and specifically Apple actually work. Honestly, it feels a bit like ChatGPT wrote some of this article. Oh boy, what are you citing here? Did ChatGPT write this? Half joking. This is the application allowed iPod users to organize their song library and update their iPod. A path-clearing antitrust enforcement case brought by the United States and State Attorney General against Microsoft opened the market and constrained Microsoft's ability to prohibit companies like Apple from offering iTunes on Windows PCs. Licensing agreements don't... No, none of that is true. That's just wrong. That is funny, but that is just wrong. Anyways, yeah. So this chart is fascinating because what it's showcasing is how much more dense laws have gotten over time. Specifically, that when the typewriter started catching on, the average law doubled in length very quick. And then when computers started to catch on, and word processing in particular, we saw consistent growth since then. Why the hell am I talking about this right now? I bring this up because I'm scared of how ChatGPT will affect this. I think lawsuits, new laws, and all of the things we're talking about here are going to get way more full of bullshit and way more wordy than they need to be because of ChatGPT. I've already seen this in my comment section where there's people who show up and give AI generated timestamps for my videos, and every timestamp is like for a 20-second piece, and the timestamp, like the title for it, is longer than the thing I said in that window. They're not marking highlights of what happened where, they're straight up adding more words to the thing I said to poorly describe it. And I think this is going to be a real impact we see with AI in law, where laws get bigger, denser, and dumber to the point where we actually need AI just to parse them in the first place. Like, I wouldn't be able to get through this gigantic DOJ thing if it wasn't for Command F. The ability to Command F and search App Store makes this significantly easier to get through, to the point where this giant document goes from useless to actually parsable. And these tools are more and more necessary as these things get more and more arbitrary. Anyways, this article actually is really good. Let's keep reading this. This is also funny that he said that this is a disservice to ChatGPT's capabilities. A lot of the points in this suit feel cherry-picked for compelling sound bites against Apple. Yep, I've seen this quite a bit too. And Apple does themselves no favors in this regard over years of correspondence. Also fair. Apple execs have said some stupid shit that went public. But the reality here is that no companies really do in these circumstances. Internal emails are almost always salacious, given enough of them. Also fair. People say provocative things in private. Yes, also fair. But that alone doesn't constitute breaking the law. Third, along those lines, Apple has done themselves absolutely no favors over many years now leading up to this case. There's without question been a vibe shift from underdog to arrogance, and it's really unbecoming to the company. Yeah, as the Apple fanboy, I'll stand by this one. When Apple gets arrogant, it feels bad because that's not the Apple I know and love. Steve Jobs loved to say that the existing solutions were wrong, but he never said the developers or the users were. He just said the other companies were. The thing Apple does now that feels weird is their willingness to say the people who are making their platform viable are wrong. The fact that Apple could say, I, as a staunch advocate for Apple and a big fan of Apple's products and somebody whose content wouldn't be possible without the things Apple enable us to do, I feel burnt by a lot of the shit they're doing. And it feels arrogant of them to do that. And it feels shitty. It is not the Apple I know and love. Genuinely. None of this is. The Apple I know would have immediately backed down, said, yeah, our cuts are too high. We're going to be less aggressive with our App Store reviews, and we're going to knock our cut down to 10% for people over 1 million and free until then. The Apple that refunded my smartphone purchase when they fucked up the loan and then sent me a free set of AirPods and like a little like care package as an apology, I haven't felt that for a bit. And this is an important point to make here, as silly as it might seem. And they clearly can't see that, at least at the top, where many of the executives have been there so long that they still think of themselves as David fighting Goliath. Also a fair point. The state of the company when Tim Cook took it over was nowhere near where they are now, and they haven't made this shift. Funny enough, a lot of the dev tool companies I talk to have a similar problem. I'll cite one of my main channel sponsors on my other software dev focused channel, the big one, the T3.gg, if you guys aren't familiar, for those who only watch Theo Rants for some reason. On that channel, I'm sponsored by a company named Vercel. Vercel was an underdog fighting hard for a long time. They somewhat recently have become the go-to standard. It took them quite a bit to have the, oh shit, we're not fighting to be relevant anymore moment, because they don't have to fight anymore. They're there. They won. They took over a section of the market. You have to adjust strategy at that point to not look like an asshole. I've even had this problem when I went from a random shit poster yelling at people on Twitter to actually making content to an audience that's reasonably large. I had to fundamentally change my approach to a lot of things so I wasn't perceived as an asshole punching down. Apple is 1000% an asshole punching down in these scenarios. Even if they're punching down at Microsoft, at Meta, at Spotify, and certainly at Epic, they're still punching down. And a lot of people who aren't that size are being hurt even more so. They may not have a traditional monopoly, but they have been the most valuable company in the world for a long period now, outside of the recent incredible run by Microsoft. Yeah, it is funny that Goliath's having revenge now that Microsoft's finally overtaken Apple. Fourth, Apple is under assault from all sides now. This is Spotify, EU, Apple. Ooh, Apple's oh shit, we fucked up moment. Does he cover this a lot? This blog is great. Yeah. The Epic EU moment slated a few months ago. Seems like this individual is covering a lot of the same shit as me. This is a very useful blog. I'm happy that we found this. Yeah, Apple is under attack, and they should be, because the App Store is bullshit. And they probably should have done more to get ahead of this inevitability. I didn't pre-read, I promise. But yes, Apple 1000% should have jumped on this way earlier, and they had the opportunity. I and many other devs have been calling this out for a while. By proactively updating App Store rules. Yeah, I 100% agree. By working more closely with developers, maybe it wouldn't have mattered for the particular case here, but a better overall sentiment around the company with various groups certainly couldn't have hurt. Yes. It's a meme, but the whole Steve Ballmer developers thing, like as stupid as it was, the goal there was important, which is when developers make your platform viable, it's probably important for them to like you some amount. And Microsoft has quadrupled down on that with everything from owning GitHub and resourcing it to hell and back so they can do crazy shit, to making VS Code the best way to write code right now. It's pretty much indisputed. It's become the industry standard despite being open source free and having nothing that makes Microsoft money in it. They've worked their asses off, even embracing Linux, just to try and make developers not hate them. Whereas Apple's tripling down on making devs hate them. That's the issue I have here. Fifth, clearly, the Department of Justice is hellbent on going after all of big tech, all at once. My personal assessment here is that while there are a number of things they could and should focus on in specific markets, overall, this is all pretty misguided. Wow, basically exactly what I said. In the case of the App Store, this makes a lot of sense. In the case of smartwatches, this makes no fucking sense at all. America has created the most valuable companies in the world, and it's a feature of the system, not a bug. Also agree here. Call me a cringe capitalist. Know that I contribute a lot of money to Bernie Sanders when you say that. Regardless, fully agree here. America's markets allow for these incredible companies to form and change how we interface with the world and each other. And the more we add restrictions that aren't based on specific harms people had, rather our vibe of how it should be, the less innovation can occur. Period. That's just how the world works. These companies are the envy of the rest of the world in many respects. And as history has proven time and time again, they tend to rise and fall by market dynamics, not due to regulation. Overall, mostly agree. Everyone will cite Microsoft here, but it's a completely different situation. And even there, Microsoft didn't fall because of the Department of Justice. Microsoft fell because the web disintermediated Windows. Weird choice of wording, but yes, the web was the thing that hurt Microsoft the most. And by not embracing it, they really risked losing the entire market, which is both why the Department of Justice had a strong case, and more importantly, why they had to fall in line. And in a way, Microsoft actually helped that happen while trying not to be disrupted. The one key here that I think is worth citing Microsoft over, which I fully agree as someone who's reported for a long time and even written research about that Microsoft Department of Justice thing, the key piece there that I'll keep hammering in is that there was things that the operating system allowed software to do that was only allowed if the software was by Microsoft. The fact that capabilities of applications on the platform were restricted if the application was not by the owner of the platform, that was the issue in that case. And that, I think, is relevant here because Apple has to bless every piece of software that goes in the App Store. There are lots of ways I can install software that Microsoft doesn't like on my Windows machine. There are many fewer ways I can install software that Apple doesn't like on my iPhone, and they're actively going out of their way to shut that down. And wait, what the fuck are we talking about? Microsoft didn't fall. Microsoft is currently worth $3.2 trillion, the most valuable company in the world again, by far. That metric, above all else, certainly seems to matter to the Department of Justice. It should probably file a case. Yeah, well. Shout out to Siegler. That was a great article. Thank you for making me feel less insane doing this, because Jesus Christ. The one other person that makes you feel way less insane from this, I'll be sure to link this in the description. If you guys don't already know Front Page Tech and John Prosser, he did a phenomenal video that actually changed my stance a bit on this. This particular video, this is the end of Apple. I went in way spicier. And after watching this one, realize the potential harm of specifically like what the EU is doing. Know that I do not agree with even the majority of what's in this video, but I think it's a really good alternative where I'm somewhere in the middle of like Apple's evil and terrible and Apple is great. They can't do any wrong. Just let them be. I'm somewhere in the middle where there are things Apple is doing that actively harm the markets, actively harm markets they're not even participating in, and overall make the freedom of software and solutions less viable. But I don't think everything Apple does is evil like many do. John leans more towards Apple's fine, why are you complaining? But think it's a reasonable take. And hopefully these will help you ground yourself as you try to figure out where you stand. Because in the end, we're all people shouting at cameras. We don't do much with this stuff. I personally am a dev that has shipped things on the iPhone, so I've had a lot of experience with these problems. I'm not some magic person that deeply understands exactly how Apple is thinking about all of these things. I'm just giving my opinions as a person who's been affected, who loves Apple, and wishes they'd do a little bit better. So let me know what you think in the comments, because I'm sure this comment section is not going to be a shit show at all. That's totally not going to happen, is it? Is it? Peace, nerds.